Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dina Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana, and it's my honor to welcome you to this evening's Mansfield Dialogue featuring Richard Hurowitz and Professor Gillian Glaes to discuss Richard's book, In the Garden of the Righteous, Lessons from the Heroic Rescuers of the Holocaust. As many of you know, the Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress more than 40 years ago to honor the dual legacy of Mike and Maureen Mansfield of ethics and public affairs and global engagement. This topic tonight was chosen particularly in reference to our support for ethics, integrity, and support of the more, I guess, ethical lens in public affairs. Mansfield's record reflects a strong moral compass and a commitment to human rights in general. So we look forward to hearing more about this evening's discussion from our speakers. I was fortunate to meet Richard Hurowitz at a Council on Foreign Relations event, and he graciously agreed to speak with us this evening. He is a writer and historian whose writing has been published in an array of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Time, and the Los Angeles Times. He is also the CEO of Octavian and Company, an investment boutique, and the publisher of Octavian Report, a not-for-profit magazine of ideas. He was also co-founder and president of the Renew Democracy Initiative. He received his BA from Yale in history and a JD from the Columbia University School of Law. Dr. Glaes is the director of the Franke Global Leadership Initiative, a partner of the Mansfield Center here in developing students with a more global perspective. She has also worked as a visiting professor in history and director of the Humanities Institute here at UM, and as a modern European historian at Carroll College in Montana. Dr. Glaes has taught widely in modern European, African, and global history, including courses on the Holocaust, genocide, World War II, and the Cold War. She has completed the Silberman Faculty Seminar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're very fortunate to have her agree to be moderator this evening, and I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that introduction. And thank you to the Mansfield Center for hosting tonight's event. And thank you to Richard Hurowitz for being here with us. I'm really excited to be with all of you here tonight and with Richard for this conversation. I wanted to start by asking, Richard, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, well, I also wanted to thank you for being in conversation and to thank everyone joining us and to thank Dina for having me. I did note in my bio I did go to Yale, and we had an exciting moment over the weekend. We thought we were actually a football playing school until we learned, although I did learn on the radio this morning that actually everyone at University of Montana was rooting for Yale because of the rivalry, I guess, with Montana State. So I'm sorry we let you down, but I'll try to make it up tonight. Yeah, no, thanks for asking. I mean, the book was actually grew up kind of organically, and every project has an origin story. I think the origin of the book for me, and this is what I kind of start the introduction with, was when I visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington when it first opened. I was an undergraduate at the time, and as I've talked to a lot of audiences, I've learned that many people find going through that museum, and it's intentional, very, very, very enervating, very draining, very upsetting. And in particular, audiences that I talk to always, and this was true for me, remember this very large pile of shoes from victims of the concentration camp, and if you look carefully, you see a lot of children's-sized shoes, and this was very traumatic to me. And when I came out at the time, there was a small exhibit devoted to rescue. And there was one small exhibit with photographs of kids who were about the age I was at the time. So I kind of gravitated over to it. And this was a group called the White Rose. And they were German students at the University of Munich, very idealistic, who tried to basically foment a student uprising against the Nazis. And they did this by circulating leaflets. The second leaflet actually, not anonymous leaflets under the name White Rose. The second leaflet is actually one of the first documents we have of anybody trying to publicize what was going on with the Holocaust. And they also tried to appeal to sort of the better angels of Germany to say this is not the Germany that we know, we are the nation of Beethoven and Goethe and, et cetera. And this went on for about a year, and they circulated all over to Berlin and all the different campuses, and even as far as Vienna in Austria. And then one day, a maintenance man who was an ardent Nazi turned in the students, and they were rounded up. They were summarily executed. One of the sort of leaders of the group were a brother and sister, the Hans and Sophie Scholl. There are more schools today named after the Scholl siblings in Germany than anyone else, but they're pretty not well known outside the US, outside of Germany. And Sophie Scholl at her trial, actually, it was quite dramatic, gave testimony where she said, everybody in Germany thinks the way we do. They're just afraid to say it. And of course, this wasn't true. We can talk about how rare, in fact, these kids were. And it was this had gone up to Hitler himself. It was covered. The leaflets would end up later being parachuted in by the British as a way of sort of trying to create uprising in Germany. And the story really stuck with me. To me, it was heartbreaking. It was beautiful and powerful at the same time. And so on the 75th anniversary of the execution of the White Rose, I wrote an op-ed about it in the New York Times. And it was basically a history piece, a memorial piece, and it went completely viral. It trended up. It was one of the top stories of the day. It was seen by, if you write something for the New York Times, it's going to have a reach in the millions. And I noticed that there was just an extraordinarily positive response to the story, and even more remarkably, there were no comments anywhere on social media that were negative. There were no Nazi comments. And I mean, I've been trolled for writing things about, the euro, and, you get Nazi comments, but nothing with this story. So I started writing them up for other publications as well. I wrote for the Times, for the Journal, for the LA Times. I had one story in the LA Times about the King of Morocco go to #2 on Reddit, which is like truly a very broad reach. And I never once, ever got sort of a Nazi comment. That's true even after the book came out, with one exception, which was when the head of the ADL tweeted about the book. He automatically gets a lot of feedback that's like, Nazi bots. But other than that, it's all positive. So I started to get the sense that there's something really inspirational, really important. The stories are very undertold for a variety of reasons. And so I decided to turn them into the book. And the book basically tells 10 different stories and also talks a little bit about, why people did this and, how we might think about making this less unusual than it was.
You mentioned the Sproul siblings and how it was rather rare in terms of how they thought about the world in which they were living. So how unusual was the act of rescuing?
Well, it was extremely unusual. So in the memorial for the Holocaust in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem gives out an award called the Righteous Among the Nations. And it's the highest award the state of Israel gives. And it has pretty stringent criterion, but it's basically given to people who risked their lives or their careers to save Jews during the Holocaust. And to date, there have been 27,000 or so people who have gotten that medal. Which sounds like a lot, but if you actually think about the population of Europe at the time was about 500 million people. So, an example I like to give is, I'm in New York, is, the size of Madison Square Garden. I learned today also, I think you can use your football stadium as an example, which my understanding seats about 25,000. If you filled that stadium up with a representative sample of the European population, you'd have one person who would have gotten the Righteous Award. So I think, as I mentioned, those criteria were very stringent. It doesn't include people who, died in rescuing. There's many rescues we don't know about. There's also things that I don't think necessarily rise to the level that you need there, but were equally important, whether it was letting someone stay the night or just even smiling or whatever. But even if you multiply by 100, you're talking about a vanishingly small number of people who actually did anything at all.
I was wondering, since we're talking about sort of the small numbers of people who actually did perform the act of rescue, and we've talked a little bit about the White Rose movement now, what were the different types, kinds, and acts of rescue that you discovered in your work on this topic?
Yeah, so as I like to take a kind of broad view of what rescue or kindness was in occupied Europe, but I did when I started the book, I really wanted to focus on, I had a few ground rules. One was I really wanted people who were in the action on the ground rescuing. Um, I wanted people, I excluded Jewish rescuers, although there were many, because I wanted people who, were literally rescuing someone else, the other, right? There were, I would put in the category of like, strong political leadership was a very important form of rescue. For example, I mean, you look at someone like Churchill, or I wrote an article earlier this year on Herbert Hoover, was actually exceptional on this issue during his end of his sort of after his presidency, very stark contrast to FDR. But if you actually look at the stories that I tell, or that I kind of focused on, there were like different types of rescue that went on. There are an unusual number of diplomats in the book, and obviously Senator Mansfield was a diplomat. They were in an unusual position because they were able to give visas to people. Dorothy Thompson, who was a journalist at the time, said we live in an era when pieces of paper decide whether someone lives or dies, but yet there were an outsized number of diplomats who helped, but an unusually small number of diplomats who did help as a percentage, because they tended to like to follow rules. There were clandestine networks. I tell the story of an Italian cyclist who was the most famous athlete in Europe, who was part of an underground network that was bringing false papers and hiding people in the cloisters in Italy. So there were people who were hiding children in schools, or even in their farm. A lot of rescue was about hiding people. And then, again, it could have even been for a night, but some people lived were hidden in homes, a lot of children, for the duration of the war. I will say that, depending on where you were in Europe, and it's important we don't, we judge people through the perspective of, the historical reality. It was more dangerous than not. If you were captured in a place, for example, like the Netherlands, you might have gone to jail. In Poland, if they caught you, they would execute you, the person you were trying to rescue, and your children. And so I think it's very hard to judge. People always say, "What would I have done?" Right? And I think it's one thing to say I would have been disadvantaged, I would have sacrificed, or even risked your own life. But when you get into rescuing your children's lives, like, we have to kind of think through that lens. But these people were, many of them extraordinarily heroic, and again, some of them were part of networks working together, and some rescue was quite solitary.
It's really interesting. I'd never really thought about the solitary nature of rescue versus the more collective approach to rescue. And that also has me thinking about what compelled people to rescue. What were their motivations, especially given that there was a big risk involved?
Yeah, this is a really, in my view, a very important question, and something I've thought a lot about. The thing about rescue during the war is that it was really ignored. I mean, it's to this day, it's actually quite overlooked, which is why I wrote the book. I mean, when you think about the number of rescuers that we know, that the average person knows, before 1994, it would have been Raoul Wallenberg, and after 94 with the movie, probably Oskar Schindler, and that's about it. And part of that is because after the war, there was a significant focus on first of all, not distorting the record, because again, they were so rare. And there was also, I think this is part of the darkness in all of us, people were more interested in the evil. Why did people do this? Why did they go along? People were interested in the Nazis. Why did this happen? And there was very little study done. There was one Freudian study that was done, like a systematic study of rescuers. All they could find as a correlation was how someone was parented in terms of discipline tended to correlate. The more irrational and violent discipline was, the more likely someone was to be an authoritarian type of sympathizer. The more loving discipline was, and the more rational, it tended to go the other way. That's not very satisfying, but it does inform a few kind of thoughts that I have on this. So I'll just give you my view from having, viewed hundreds of these cases. Is I think, first of all, there were certain things that definitely made people more likely to rescue. One was people that were in international professions, or who were, things like, diplomacy, or creative professions. So, there's a rescue in the circus in my book that I tell, things where these are cultures of tolerance and sort of creativity that tended to correlate. Most people who rescued were definitely inspired by something greater than themselves. It could have been political, like liberal democracy or the ideal of Germany. It could have been it could have been, you know, the Albanians had a code of hospitality, but more often than not, it was religion. And it was kind of cross religion. So it was, you know, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, Muslims, but it was generally people who had a view of religion that was not about the importance of external displays of piety, but really a real internal understanding of like the teachings. I mean, I think the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews than anything else during the war. So that was very important. But if you ask me, the number one thing, to go back to that study that I saw, is that pretty much every rescuer that I've come across had in their early childhood a figure, at least one figure, often a parent, but not always, who did a couple of things. One is, which is probably pretty obvious, is that they, you know, exposed them to other people, whether it was Jews or others. They said, we don't believe in hatred, we don't believe in bigotry, you know, we're that's not who we are. And you know, you know, Raina Sendler, who is an amazing a woman in the book. I tell her story. She was a social worker in Poland, which was kind of the worst part of the Holocaust. And she went in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto several times a week, saved 2,500 children. Her father was a doctor who died when she was 8 of cholera that he caught from some very poor Jews that he was treating. And he had taught her that he said to her, if you see, and she talked about this till the end of her life, if you see somebody drowning, you must save him. And so that was the ethos she had. So that was the one thing. The other thing that they did, which I think is quite interesting, is that most of these children, I mean, most of these rescuers grew up as children in very loving homes, and they had their interests valued. And this is really important because it's a little bit more subtle, but if you think about it, to be a rescuer at a time when the entire world had lost its moral compass, when literally the world had turned upside down, you have to really have very strong self-confidence, which you get from how you're raised. And you really have to believe that what you believe morally is correct and everyone else is wrong. And you also have to believe, if you're going to take drastic action, that actually you might be successful, which also requires a lot of self-confidence. So, you know, I think that was a really, you know, again, that one of the things I've learned is that the most important moment is childhood for developing, you know, what they call the altruistic personality.
That's so interesting. I've thought so much about the motivations and why people were compelled to rescue, and so it's really interesting to hear the variations.
I mean, one thing I would add is, on the other hand, if you ask them, it is almost eerie that they use the same language over and over. They say, I didn't do anything special. I did what everyone else would have done. I just did the decent thing. And I don't think it was false modesty, but it is almost universal that none of these people view themselves as particularly heroic.
That's so interesting, because I think in terms of how we think about them, we think of them so much as heroes. And you've mentioned now a few different figures in the book. And when I read it, I was really stunned by the breadth and the depth of the presentation and of the stories of each of the rescuers. So I'm wondering who your favorite rescuer is in the book and why.
Well, I can't answer that question. I cannot, you know, that's like, who's your favorite child? You cannot answer that. But I will tell you one story that the Christian Science Monitor called I will tell you the story I would pick is probably the one I open the book with, which is the story of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and the Christian Science Monitor called him the breakout star of the book. So I'll give you a short version of his story. This is him, by the way. I don't know if you can see that, but so his name, he was a diplomat. He was Portuguese, and he was a twin. And he was born to an aristocratic family actually was still a monarchy when he was born. And he and his brother, twin brother, both they went to law school, and then they entered into the Foreign Service. And they actually grew up with Salazar, who later became the dictator of Portugal. And the brother was one of these, you know, very, very kind of had a meteoric rise, extremely talented, became foreign minister. Sousa Mendes was also a very talented diplomat, but a different kind of diplomat. He was sort of one of these like bon vivants. He was posted all over the world, he had like, Einstein was in his house teaching his kids how to do math. One of his daughters was a flower girl in one of the royal weddings. He was that kind of person. And, he had 14 children, and in his house in Portugal, they flew the flag of every country where he had a child. And he was posted at one point in Berkeley, California. So he had two Americans. They flew the American flag in his home in Portugal. And in June of 1940, he found himself as the consul general in Bordeaux. And if you remember earlier, I said that visas were the critical thing, and so he had the ability to give visas. Now, a few months earlier, and this is sort of important to understand, Salazar, who was this sort of Machiavellian figure in Portugal, he was very anti-communist. He wasn't quite a fascist, but most important thing to him was keeping Portugal out of the war. And to do that, he needed to be very close to Franco. And Franco was a fascist who was allied with Hitler. And Franco did not want any refugees coming across the border of the Pyrenees. And so Salazar had sent out a circular called Circular 14 to every embassy, in which he basically said that nobody was allowed to come in without a stamp of approval from Lisbon, except for, and there were a few exceptions, it was like Americans, British, famous people, if they were French people, if they were famous, whatever. And then it said no Jews and no people with stateless people, which was effectively Jews, but anyone without a passport. And Sousa Mendes, a couple of people had come to him, including one non-Jew who was an anti-fascist, and he had given them visas, and he'd already been reprimanded because he had this humanitarian impulse. He could not bear to see these people on the run who were like in terror and in danger of their lives. And so he had given them visas because if you could get to Lisbon, you could get to Portugal, which was neutral, you could generally get on to, you were free and you could get on to usually, the America or South America. If you remember the movie Casablanca, they're all trying to get on a plane to Lisbon and wait, right in the opening scene. So June of 1940, he found himself in Bordeaux, and that was when the Paris fell. So, the opening scene of the chapter is the people who wrote Curious George, who were German Jews, were actually bicycling with the manuscript of Curious George, and they were trying to get south, as was everyone. So if you can imagine, in June of 1940, there's the worst, I think it's fair to say it was the worst traffic jam in human history. It was like 5 million people going from Paris south. Because the German army was coming, and overhead you had like these terrible scenes with the Luftwaffe strafing people. People literally saw their family members killed. It was just mass chaos, and they were on bicycles, so they were able to kind of weave in and out of the traffic. And they, along with a number of people, got to Bordeaux. And in Bordeaux, it was a wild scene because you had the French government had fled there. You had the future French government, the Vichy politicians were there. De Gaulle was there. Churchill showed up, and then you just had literally millions of refugees everywhere, and people were desperate to get out. And so the rumor went around, and they were going door to door, and everybody was slamming the door shut, including the United States of America. But the rumor went around that the Portuguese consul general might be sympathetic. So they started to line up outside of his embassy, and Sousa Mendes was very distraught, but he went out and he saw a young rabbi who had a large family of young children. And, Sousa Mendes had sent his family, except for his two oldest sons, home to Portugal. And he said, he said to the rabbi, look, you have a big family, like don't sleep on the street, come stay in the consulate with me. And so he came in and they had a long conversation overnight. And Sousa Mendes talked about he was a very, very devout Catholic. He believed some of his ancestors were descended from converted Jews in the Inquisition. And at the end of the night, he said to the rabbi, look, I think I can give you visas for your family. And the rabbi said to him, I couldn't actually accept the visas. What about all the other Jews? It wouldn't be right. And so he went back out, and Sousa Mendes had what he described in a letter that I saw in Portuguese to his brother as a nervous breakdown. He took to his bed for a while, and then he suddenly got up and he made the announcement to his family, his wife and his two oldest boys. His nephew was there, and he sent his staff, and he said, "I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God." And then he went out and very dramatically said, and there are many witnesses, he said, "I'm going to give a visa to anybody who needs it, regardless of your religion, creed, background. And he did that. And then over the course of the next 3 weeks, he wrote visas for everyone from Salvador Dali and the Habsburg family to Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's art dealer, but then just thousands and thousands of poor Jews on the run. And at one point, and this is how history plays out, a British woman who wanted a tourist visa went to the consulate, and she was asked to wait for a minute because there were so many refugees, and she became irate and left. And in an act of supreme pettiness, she actually complained to the British embassy that wired Lisbon, and this brought this to the attention of Salazar himself. And he then sent his ambassador to Spain across the border in a limousine, and a cat and mouse game then sort of ensued, where Sousa Mendes then started moving to other places on the border to give people visas and escort them across while they were trying to basically stop him. And it was a race against the clock because everybody knew once the French government capitulated, that Germans would, that then everybody was really like it would, the situation was dire. And that is what happened. And so after 3 weeks, the music stopped. Sousa Mendes in those 3 weeks did what is widely considered by scholars to be the largest rescue of anyone by an individual during the Holocaust. He saved somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people, which means that there are at least 100,000, probably 200,000 people alive today because of his activity in 3 weeks. What happened to him? He was summoned back to Lisbon and he was disciplined. And the investigator determined that he had acted out against his orders, but he had this humanitarian impulse and he should be disciplined and punished, but not, that was it. The head of the foreign minister said, no, he needs to be demoted. Salazar personally said, actually, because he really resented the Sousa Mendes brothers. He viewed him as a spoiled aristocrat. He fired him. He took away his pension, and he was shunned. And so then Sousa Mendes, he was continually appealing. He lost his law license. He went through his entire life savings. His wife died. He had a stroke. And then he died, very prematurely, kind of penniless. His children couldn't find work; they had to leave the country. And then to add insult to injury, at the end of the war, Salazar basically switched sides to the U.S. and then he became a founding member of NATO. And one of the reasons they sort of justified it is they said, well, the Portuguese were so good with refugees, and this drove Sousa Mendes crazy. It was true at the end of the war; they were, even Salazar was good, but during this time, and so they basically ruined him. And it wasn't the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. So the Israelis recognized Sousa Mendes early on, and the United States recognized him in the 80s, but it wasn't until the mid 90s and after the Salazar government was long gone, but even in the 90s that he was finally rehabilitated, and he was actually given the rank of posthumously ambassador, and he's now a national hero. But again, I think there's a historical injustice that we all know the name of someone like Heinrich Himmler or Hermann Goering, but so few people know this man who literally had his life destroyed for taking this action. And I often you can see, I showed you his picture, and you see like sort of this kindness, and there are these, you can imagine what it would have been like to have met him in this very desperate moment. And there's all kinds of eyewitness testimony I try to recount of how he sort of was this calming, kind presence. And he just made a decision that again, even the Americans didn't, and then none of the other ambassadors did. And so he's there's something extraordinarily special about him and his story.
In thinking about someone like Sousa Mendes being posted in France and being able to issue those, somewhere between 10 and 30,000 visas in the span of 3 weeks, and thinking about the idea of place-based rescue, why do you think places such as Denmark, for example, rescued so many of the Jewish people living within their borders? And how did they do this? And then by contrast, why did other places not rescue members of the Jewish community living in their boundaries, in their borders?
Yeah, well, the second part of your question, I think this was what happened, and anti-Semitism and dehumanization. And some people did this because they really believed, what was being preached by the Nazis. Some people were quite opportunistic. Some people did it for petty reasons, spite, or, try to get back at someone. But it was, the moral, just morality went out the window, and Jews are a minority, and people just gave them. And it wasn't just Jews, also it was, Romani and gay people and people who were, a lot of artists and writers and politicians, et cetera. But to flip it around, why did some places? Because it is important to know that this wasn't universal, right? Which actually the flip side is it shows you that it doesn't have to happen. So, you mentioned Denmark was one of the few places. Denmark's the most famous because it was the entire nation of Denmark. There were other places as well where, in Denmark, about 95+% of the Jews survived. I tell the story of a town called Le Chambon, which was a Protestant town in France on a smaller scale, but 5,000 people, Jews, were saved there. The country of Albania, which is a majority Muslim country, is the only country in Europe with more Jews in it at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war. And just to tell you how, it wasn't because it was just remote, because at the Wannsee conference, where the Nazis met to actually plan the final solution, they had a famous list that you can Google, where they listed each country and the Jews that were in it. And so it said, Poland, however many million, and then listed everyone. Albania, 200. So it was on their radar screen. Denmark is, very unusual. I mean, just to briefly, the story, and I recounted in the book, was that, they basically under occupation, it's pretty remarkable. They saved, a member of the German Nazi Party who was not an anti-Semite tipped off the Danish people, and they, over the course of a few days, they did sort of like a Dunkirk, where they literally rode all of their Jewish neighbors across the straits to Sweden, including Niels Bohr, who later joined the Manhattan Project. And only a few hundred were accidentally rounded up. They were sent to a camp called Theresienstadt. But even there, the Danish government checked on them every week. They sent them food. They sent them medicine. They insisted on inspecting. So all but 50 of them died. That 50 died of disease. And so you had this. And when they came back, people found, because in a lot of places, Jews came back, they weren't entirely welcomed back. Their businesses had been stolen, their property. Here, their houses were waiting for them. Their plants had been watered. Their pets had been fed. It was remarkable. And why did this happen? I mean, I think there were a few reasons, but I think, first of all, in Denmark, religious bigotry is anathema to the culture, and it had actually been legally banned for several hundred years. The Danish Jews, most of them were called the Viking Jews. They were actually descendants of Spanish Jews who had been expelled in 1492. They'd been there a very long time. The Danes viewed their Jewish neighbors as, Danes first and Jews second. They were friends, they were colleagues, they were neighbors. So that culture was there. And then, they refused to, from the beginning, turn over the Jews. And in fact, it started with the king. And there's an apocryphal story that the king himself wore a Star of David the way the Jews were forced to. And the reason that's not true is because the Danes would not permit the Star of David to actually be, the Jews to be forced to wear it. And even under occupation, the fascist party in Denmark polled at about 2% or less. So they didn't like the Nazis. They stood up to them from the beginning. They said, you cannot round up our Jews. The people who were, now the reason why this was effective, in part, there's a bunch of idiosyncratic reasons, but the German army and navy concluded that it was a bad idea to try to round up the Jews because it was going to upset the population so much that they would have to deal with a lot of unrest. And even the SS recommended not doing it because the Danes had been very clear that this would be a problem for them. They would not tolerate it. And the last thing, the Germans wanted, the army, was a problem. This actually went up and Hitler personally had to issue the roundup. And sure enough, exactly what happened was that there was this resistance where they took the Jews out. And a year later, there was an uprising and it triggered this. And so, to some degree, the German, the army officers were correct. So at the end of the day, almost the entire population of Denmark survived. Why? That is such an outlier. but it is so important. When my book came out, I wrote an article for the journal talking about Denmark and Albania and why these places, because, you know, this was communities acting. And, you know, we may not, you know, there was a rescuer in Holland who was asked, he was one of these kind of really risked his life kind of people. And he said the reason why he was more effective than in places like in Poland was that in Holland, he said, you can't expect everyone to act like we do. We're the tip of the spear. But it was the fact that everyone else looked away. No one turned anyone in. I mean, not no one, but less likely, which was the biggest risk to any rescue. And so was denunciation. So the way a community behaves is really critical. And it's not just to combat, homicidal genocide. It's actually combating any kind of bigotry, and that you get the vast majority of the population believes that, then you can stand up even to the Nazis. And the village I mentioned was a non-violent village. They did not believe in violence, yet they were able to stand up to the Nazis. Is a very powerful message that is relevant today.
That's so, there are so many things. Gosh, I wish we had like 2 more hours to talk because there's so many different points that you've raised that I would love to follow up on. I did want to invite people to begin posting questions in the Q&A box if they haven't already. And as we start to shift to the Q&A, I just wanted to ask one last question, and I think it really dovetails well with what you've just talked about in terms of the choices that people make to rescue, whom they choose to stand up to and why. So what examples of bravery and heroism do we see in the world today, and who are the rescuers among us today?
Well, I mean, there's bravery and heroism all the time. I'm sitting here in New York. I remember the, policemen and the firemen running into the Twin Towers. I'm a native New Yorker. There have been 40 genocides since World War II. And there's always been rescue. I actually had the privilege of meeting after the book came out with Paul Rusesabagina, who was, if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, that was him. He was the manager of the hotel in Rwanda. He saved 1,600 people. I will say, when I met him, he was like a person out of my book. I mean, like, it was the exact, he was like out of central casting in terms of why he did it, what motivated him, what his background was. It was fascinating. The fact that he didn't really think he did anything particularly impressive. So, there are rescuers. I've seen rescue in Afghanistan. I've seen rescue everywhere. I will say one thing that is troubling, which has been noted, which is in Gaza, as the hostages have returned, there's been not one example of rescue. Now, it was not true on October 7th. There were Muslims who died trying to protect people from Hamas. But I think, I assume that we will see rescue, but I will say that is an important thing to note, because I think the level of dehumanization that has gone on in Gaza with Hamas and in the education system was extreme. And so, that's but other than that, there's always these stories, and I'm sure stories will come out there. So the rescuers are alive and well. I just think we're lucky, despite everything going on, that we're not living through something like the Holocaust or World War II, and I hope we never do. But these people are always with us.
One question that has come up in the chat that I wanted to start with in terms of the Q&A is one that actually I was wondering too as I was reading the book. In terms of the rescuers you've studied, did they survive their efforts, or were they discovered and executed or imprisoned because of what they did?
So it's a mix. Most of so many rescuers died, and there are rescuers in my book who perish. There were Irena Sendler, who I mentioned earlier, was literally arrested, was tortured, and was being led to her execution when the Polish underground paid a bribe to save her. So some of them died. There are many rescues we don't know about because people died doing it, both the rescuee and the rescuer. Many, like Susan Mendez, many rescuers, which was more the norm, suffered for what they did, or certainly weren't rewarded for it. And behind the Iron Curtain, that was actually quite dangerous to be a rescuer, because there was an implication that, there was institutional anti-Semitism, but there was also an implication that you must have been allied with the Allies, and so you were suspected as an anti-communist. But I mean, just because the war ended didn't mean anti-Semitism ended. Oskar Schindler literally had rocks thrown at him after the war. People were said, why did you do this? Why did you, no one likes the Jews. You could have brought danger to our community by doing this. And so, more often, there's this sad kind of, lack of recognition and sort of almost, punishment that not exclusively that came with this. I mean, Gino Bartoli, who was the Italian cyclist, went on to great fame. He never told anybody what he did. The rescue in the circus was a successful rescue. Again, the guy was pretty famous in the circus world, never really, talked about it. So it wasn't everybody who suffered, but it is troubling, the way that, these people were treated after the war. I think the reason, honestly, is that they're very inconvenient. And, this was a big issue. In fact, I was just watching a documentary about Leni Riefenstahl that was just out, and she was interviewed on German TV, and you could see people defending her. This is the woman who made all the propaganda films for Hitler and was kind of a knowing accomplice. I think it's very inconvenient for people to say, though, I couldn't have done anything, or everyone was doing this, there was nothing I could do, when you have someone living next door to you that actually did something. So I think the rescuers, a lot of them were quite hated, because they present an example of the way other people should have behaved.
I do hear that a lot in my own courses and in my conversations with people, that there was nothing anyone can do. And I think your book and these stories really show us that there were a lot of things that people could do in a lot of different ways. One question that came to mind as I was listening to your response was, how did you find these stories in the first place? Where was it that you looked to find stories of rescue?
I mean, once you start drilling into these things, it's pretty organic. So, the Yad Vashem archives in Israel were kind of a treasure trove, because anybody who gets the medal, there's a very long, thick file of eyewitness testimony. I mean, we ended up, I say we because I only speak two languages, but I think I had some help going through, I think, 12 or 13 different languages of, testimony. A friend of mine, Abe Foxman, who ran the ADL and was himself a hidden child, was very involved with sort of the movement to rescue people. So he was helpful in kind of introducing me to people. There was a story I came across about Denmark, a Danish rower who was at the Olympics. He actually had been honored by the person who at the time was my own rabbi. But I was looking for stories that spoke to me, that were also in some degree, cinematic and really dramatic and really good stories. And then I wanted sort of a cross section of the kind of rescue that went on. So, you have somebody like Irena Sendler, but then you have, what was going on in Italy and what was going on in France and what was there. There's a chapter on Greece where actually one of the main protagonists is actually King Charles's grandmother, Princess Alice, who's been honored, as well as the metropolitan, the chief, basically the Archbishop of Athens, who's the only head of a church to denounce the Holocaust, Damaskinos.
One question that came in from the chat was, what organizations today actively communicate examples of civilian self-protection from the Holocaust and elsewhere that might be useful for those facing a modern genocide?
Sorry, can you? I'm not sure I understand the question. Yeah.
It's an interesting one. What organizations today actively communicate examples of civilian self-protection that might be useful for those facing a modern genocide? So,
I mean,
yeah.
I don't really know. I mean, I think I think it's very important to, the issues of history and memory are very important. So I think the institutions that keep the memory alive of what happened during the Holocaust, and most of them actually have programs on other genocides as well, in terms of memory. And so you have the U.S. Holocaust Museum, the USC Shoah Project, Yad Vashem. I think some of the NGOs, I mean, on not to get into politics, some of them are quite compromised, but places like the IRC, which is, was founded actually for the, related to the Holocaust and that like the rescue, places that try to go in and do sort of neutral work and really just help. I think there's tons of civil society trying to do that.
One question that I'm thinking of too is if you could ask these, well, first of all, let me back up a second. Have you met any of the rescuers or their descendants?
Their descendants, yes. I actually interviewed quite a number of children of rescuers, which was fascinating because it was honestly a mixed bag. It was really fascinating. For example, I have a chapter on Varian Fry, who's sort of well known. He rescued many of the most famous artists and writers, and he was sort of single-handedly. He's an American intellectual, young guy in his 30s. He was basically the main reason the art world moved from Paris to New York, and all the writers came out to California. It was a program that was set up by Eleanor Roosevelt. He's a legend. His son I interviewed didn't really like him. He found him to be sort of violent and kind of a bipolar guy. Whereas the guy who we worked with, Hiram Bingham, who was a diplomat, he'd gone to Yale. His father discovered Machu Picchu. There was the famous Hiram Bingham. It was supposed to be Indiana Jones. His children, I interviewed 3 of them. He had 11 children. They viewed him as a saint. So these guys worked together, totally different view. And I interviewed a woman whose parents were the pastor and his wife of the town that I mentioned, and they were very famous leaders in the nonviolent movement. They knew Gandhi. They later knew Martin Luther King. They were real do-gooders. And I talked to her. She read my chapter and she was amazing. She had total recall because she was like 14 at the time. She's like 96 years old. So she said, the color of the carpet was actually orange, not yellow. I mean, it was remarkable. And so I said, how were your parents? Were they? And she said, well, they were busy. They were good parents. She said, they weren't going to come to my piano recital because they were too busy. And so she was still upset. She was 95 years old. She was still upset they didn't come to her piano recital, which tells me that, a lot of these people, they were all, there were very few of them like Irena Sendler, who was a social worker by profession. These were people, Shakespeare has the great line in Twelfth Night, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. These were people in that third category. And they were very flawed, a lot of them. There's a woman who co-founded Zagota, which saved many, many Polish Jews. And her co-founder was a liberal Democrat whose husband had been ambassador to Washington. She was like a known anti-Semite. That's what she was known for, but she didn't think the Jews should be murdered. And so talking to the children, you get a sense that these are very real people. They were flawed. Some of them were good parents. Some of them weren't good parents. They had their own issues, which to me was very hopeful because it tells you that you don't have to be a saint to be a hero, right? But they rose to the occasion at the worst moment in history when so many other people didn't. But so you don't have to be perfect. You just have to kind of, when the chips were down, they did the right thing. So, and obviously their children know them better than anyone. And again, some of them thought their parents were great and some of them didn't. Although even Varian Fry's son did say to me, he thought that was if his father had not been manic, he didn't think he'd have been able to do the rescue he did.
One question that came up for me as I was listening to your response there is if you could meet one of the rescuers, say Susan Mendez, for example, what would you ask them?
Oh my gosh. That's such a good question. And no one's ever asked me that. I would ask the obvious question, which is, I guess I would ask why. And then I would be curious what they thought from if it was now, about how the history has treated them. Although that's not why they did it.
Right. Especially with the case of Susan Mendez. One question that's come in from the audience is what advice, and I will take this too as I get ready to teach my class on this topic going forward. What advice would you give to teachers of the Holocaust? And what is the most important message you want students to remember?
Well, look, there's so many important issues on this. I can say it through the frame of rescue because, the Holocaust Museum in Washington is actually redoing its exhibit right now, and it's going to center rescue more. And my book is being adopted by some curriculum of people who go in to teach genocide and rescue. I think is very important because, and it's never going to be anything other than a small fraction of Holocaust, scholarship. And it is very important to teach people why did this happen? Why did everyone go along with it? How do you just end up with this country like Nazi Germany? That's more important than anything. But I think the reason why stories of rescue are important is twofold. One is, I have a friend of mine who directed a movie about Le Chambon, who says, he has a great quote, Pierre Sauvage, that stories of rescue are like a banister you can hold on to when you first look at the evil. And, to start to talk to children, and we need to do that, about something as traumatic as the Holocaust is, it's very difficult. And people shut down. And, if you start by, there's a wonderful book called Number the Stars about the Danish rescue. And if you start to sort of tell the story through the lens of something positive, and then you say, okay, well, why were these people on the run, and what was going on? It's an entry point into talking about kind of the horror of the Shoah. And I also think it's hopeful, not that I mean, it's important to, obviously, again, the Holocaust was a uniquely bad moment in history. It's like the worst moment in history. But even then, right, there were these sort of Golda Meir, when they dedicated the Garden of the Righteous, she said, these people are like drops of love in an ocean of poison. Hannah Shanesh, who was a poet and a paratrooper, who sort of actually died fighting, she had a wonderful metaphor of comparing the rescuers to like the stars whose light reaches us, like many years later, and they're extinct. She said, they're extinct, but we still see their light, and they light the way for mankind. So I think like they are the example that is so important about like how to prevent this. And when the most important thing that they can teach, right, is moral agency, moral decision making. And so, you can use them to say, okay, like everyone, as you teach about what everyone else did, why did these people do this? And what would you do? And by the way, I think it's really important to think about like if the stakes were lower, which is why I think like the anti-bullying campaign is so important, to say like the most important thing you can do is to teach people like speak out and actually really like stick together and create a community like Denmark, where the majority not only is against it, but they speak out against it, and they don't just go along with it. And if you get like, there's safety in numbers, you get everybody doing it. And so that's why these, again, and the idea that you can do something and that you should do something is really important. And that's, I think, the lessons that so again, and it's about agency, right? And that's why, again, like the people who teach this are really more and more trying to focus on this as at least part of the conversation.
The last question we have for tonight, I'm just going to paraphrase because it's a pretty big question, and just kind of touch on a few things you've mentioned. So you talked about the film about Oskar Schindler, the film about the rescue of the Danish Jews. There's Judgment at Nuremberg, and so many other sort of portrayals of the story and related stories in the media. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the power of the media in inspiring ethical action today.
I think it's crucial. And I think, look, different people consume different media. I think actually I happen to be involved with publishing, and I think it's actually remarkably resilient. So I think that, like that's very important. Obviously, film, podcasts have been, but it's also very dangerous, and I think, every time there's been a major change in media is led to terrible catastrophe. We're going back to the printing press. I think World War II and the rise of fascism was a function of the radio, and film and TV was sort of an adjunct of radio. We haven't had a major inflection point until social media, and the combination of social media and AI, and like sort of the inability to be critical or understand where truth is, and truth being at sea, is so dangerous. Right now we have a movement to, for example, say that Winston Churchill was the villain of World War II. And I have I have a friend who is probably the leading biographer of Winston Churchill, who has gone out to defend Churchill, which is shocking that he needs to do that. But it's just, he's put on the same parallel as somebody who just has a podcast who's a comedian. And I think this is like a very important thing. Maybe, I don't know what the solution is for that, but storytelling, I think, is very important. I mean, I've thought about doing a TikTok series on rescuers, but but I think at the end of the day, people, wherever you are, respond to story. And, that's why I think, storytelling is it's so important. And, classic, like, things last, and like, these are amazing stories and they need to be told. And I think, if we can tell them, is my view, they're so powerful. And there's such great examples, but there's such powerful stories at such a dramatic moment that, they can reach a lot of people. And again, going back, like, these are, it bothers me that more people know, again, about the Nazi high command than know about, Sousa Mendes. So I have like a little mission to hopefully change that. But I think, this is the fundamental issue of our times, is probably how do we communicate good values and avoid propaganda, which is really, a problem we're grappling with now.
My very last question, with about a minute left, if you could just summarize your overall message in terms of rescue and World War II from your book, what would you say?
I mean, two things. I think these people, we all owe them a debt of gratitude for keeping hope alive in the human spirit and sort of the divine spark in all of us. So I think that's critical. I would also say that, these are very dramatic moments, but everybody can make a difference. And I'll just leave you with the fact that that Primo Levi, for his whole life, talked about a man who rescued him in Auschwitz, and he basically rescued him by sneaking him food. And when he reflected on it, he said it wasn't even the food that saved his life. It was the fact that somebody else actually saw his humanity and actually treated him with kindness. And it gave him the strength to keep going. And I think, not that we're all in those circumstances, but people, that kind of fundamental moment of kindness that we can all do every day, I think is the message that I get from these people, is to make the small sort of effort. I think is like a very powerful thing to do on a daily basis that will make our society more resilient and stronger and better.
Wow, thank you. That is such a wonderful note to leave this conversation on. Richard, I really want to thank you for your time tonight. I think
Thank
you've
you for having
inspired
me.
all of us, of course, here in attendance this evening. I also want to thank Dina Mansour and the team at the Mansfield Center for making tonight's Mansfield Dialogue possible, and for inviting me to host this conversation. It's been a great honor and a privilege. I also want to thank our audience members for attending tonight and participating, and for your questions. You're all the reason we do this. So thank you so much, and we hope that you have a great evening. Thanks again, Richard. Take care.
Thank you.